So this talk is Liquid Democracy with Google Votes. And I'm going to talk about liquid democracy, and I'm going to talk about Google Votes, and then I'm going to be talking about the design decisions and UX we use for Google Votes, as well as going into the algorithms for delegated voting that backs it all. So in terms of democracy for the scope of this talk, we're talking about democratic decision making. There's other aspects of democracy, such as individual liberties or freedom of the press, other institutions like this. Here we're focusing on the decision-making aspects. You've got a group of people, and they have a bunch of issues or decisions, and somehow you want to aggregate, although democracy has that effect as well. But you want to aggregate individual choices into group decisions. Kind of the options we have right now are direct democracy and representative democracy. Now, direct democracy is kind of like perfect utopia. You know, it's great. It's everybody votes for everything. You have control. You have transparency, accountability. It's fair. Doesn't scale. Does not scale at all. There's no way that everybody has the time and expertise to really vote on everything that affects them at every level. So we typically scale by using a representative democracy system. And here again, we're talking about groups of all different levels. This could be city, state, national governments. This could be the chess club at your high school, or it could be a PTA or a volunteer organization. You elect some representatives who have the time and the expertise to vote for you. Now this leads to a lot of problems, which is kind of the typical things people usually complain about politics, and that it's not transparent or accountable, and that you end up with this focus on the candidates. These people who become this focus of the representative, they have this extra power. People start caring about things like does your representative have good hair, and that matters. You also get, and as opposed to focusing on the issues which do matter. You also get distortions from the election cycle itself, because elections take a lot of overhead, and you get silly things like, oh, we can't make this happen, it's an election year. It's purely an artifact. So liquid democracy is a design to approach the shortcomings of both approaches and take the best of both direct and representative democracy. So in liquid democracy, or delegative proxy is kind of the term you'll see in the literature, people can delegate their votes to others, and you can delegate at any time. There's no elections. You just use a tool to set who your delegates are, and anybody can be a delegate. So your delegates are often people you trust and or that people they know. And delegation is transitive, in that if I delegate to one person, they can delegate to others, and my vote can flow through this entire delegation graph. Now, you never have to do what your delegate says. So unlike representative democracy, where you kind of sell the farm when you elect someone to be your representative. For example, this character in orange with the cell phone, he's delegated his vote to the right, but then for issue 1, you can see he's got a long arrow, and he's chosen to override his delegated vote and vote directly. So it kind of creates kind of a meritocracy. For example, the woman in green, you can see a lot of people have delegated to her. She's kind of analogous to a representative in that she's gathered quite a bit of power, but still all these people can vote individually if they want. So liquid democracy, the earliest paper I could find was written in 1969 by James Miller. And it's quite a good paper. It's only 6 pages, but it's kind of lays out the whole foundation of delegated voting and defines the term delegate proxy. Even kind of talks about computer voting, which is pretty good for its time. I'll mention 2 other papers, and there's a number of others. I have a kind of reading list compiled at go/Google Votes if you want to find out more. Another paper is this by James Green Armitage, which is voluntary delegation as the basis of a future political system. This is just a really good overview of delegation, and has a lot of background for different approaches that have been taken up till there. It's a real good introduction to the concept. Then also another paper I mentioned, just because this is the paper that seemed to have the most details on like how would you actually build such a system. And it has this concept of hierarchical forums, which is kind of similar to the concept of tags, Google Votes tags, which I'll introduce. There are several implementations out there of liquid democracy. The most famous is liquid feedback, which is used by the Pirate Party. This is the Pirate Party was founded by the founders of the Pirate Bay, who are not big fans of copyright, to say the least. But the pirate parties have spread across Europe, and their biggest success has been in Germany, where they've won seats in the parliament and at various times. In liquid feedback, there's kind of these issues, and they have very distinct phases. Like you kind of create a new issue, then there's a discussion phase where people talk about it, and then you freeze it, and then people vote on the results. It's kind of a full life cycle thing. There's also some other products out there, adhocracy, also used in Germany. It's kind of been used by some local groups to talk to their citizens. I don't know if it's really taken off as well as they'd like, but it's kind of got a similarly kind of a wiki-like feel to it. I also ran across a product called NetConference Plus. I couldn't even find, I saw mentions in the literature, but I couldn't even find any screenshots, much less anything actually running on this guy. But I found a cool little book. There was this Swedish group called DemoX, or Democracy Experiment, that managed to get a seat on a suburb of Stockholm in their city council. And their platform was that whatever people would vote for on the online tool, that's what they would vote, directly as representative. And they did this for a couple of years, and it was, they had some success. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so Google Votes. So this is mixing liquid democracy and a social network. There's this concept that a lot of the reason liquid democracy hasn't taken off is it requires a lot of infrastructure to do it. And that hasn't been available, until now, where now we've got this type of infrastructure to actually automate these type of things, count votes, have better identity and such. Now, given that I'm an engineer at Google and I work for social, you could probably guess which social network I had in mind to implement this on. So the analogy I kind of think of is an electric network. So an electric network, you got a bunch of wires and electric devices kind of plugged together. In an electric network, an electric wire can flow either information or power. And if you're a USB cord, you do both. But social networks, similarly, you've got these links and edges between people. Mostly they're used for flowing information. So the proposal here is to implement a liquid democracy system and flow power through your social network. And this is binding decision-making authority. So this is Google, you write code. So I'm like, okay, let's build it. So about 2.5 years ago, I started building a delegative proxy backend, and I've been working with workplace services running votes across Google since then. So my goal here is to build kind of a live active delegation network internally within Google, internal Google Plus, and then kind of use that to get support to build this stuff natively as a public product, which I'll talk about more at the end. So just a bit about Google Votes. At this point, we've been running it for 2 years. 11,000 Googlers have cast votes using Google Votes, about 75,000 votes. For example, the Kirkland Halloween costume contest or the Hangouts t-shirt was chosen with Google Votes, as well as the name of the Troll Cafe in Seattle. Also some products with the Google Store, and named a few buildings. But by far the biggest one has been the September Mountain View Microkitchen Fair. And this is a event where about 8,200 Googlers attended, and we got 4,600 Googlers to vote based on this event. This is just all you can kind of see the picture in the upper right corner there. It's they filled a whole football field full of vendors, and then all the vendors kind of had little posters and QR codes that said, "Hey, vote for me." And there were 25 categories of food. So based on this vote, that vote is actually what defines the 2014 Mountain View Microkitchen lineup. So all the choices in the microkitchens are based on that vote. So that's kind of that's our biggest success so far. In terms of delegation usage, we've actually, in some ways, gotten more than we expected, because the big thing with building a liquid democracy system is having a liquid democracy system, a decision-making tool, and using it by yourself is silly. You need people, you need groups. It's a very strong network effect. So we're like, okay, how do we get over this hump and get people to actually vote enough to make delegation meaningful? And that's why we partnered with Workplace Services and have mostly been focusing on the basic voting experience, making the UI polished and making it easy to vote. So you can see my talk last week, which was all about on the voting mechanics and the voting algorithms. And you can go to go/Google Votes and find links to that talk. It's about a 35-minute video. Still, we had delegation implemented. We didn't really advertise it, but some people figured it out. And in fact, 9 users out of 4,600, they started sending around delegation ads, which I showed, and they managed to get, the 9 of them managed to control 2,900 votes out of 62,000. So we got 0.2% of the users controlling 4.7% of the vote, which is like a 24 times multiplier. And we weren't even trying, really. Like the most successful delegate was an engineer in Mountain View who sent an email to the vegans mailing list saying, hey, I'm going to represent you for vegan food options. You don't want to bother voting on all these 25 things. Give me your delegation. And he managed to get 15 voting power. Okay, so now I'll talk a little about design decisions. So as I mentioned, a lot of the literature doesn't really drill down into how do you actually implement a liquid democracy system. So, I just kind of tried stuff and saw what worked. So here's the decisions we made. So first, we've got the notion that there are issues. Obviously, there's people and there's issues. That's kind of obvious. But we went with this concept of tags, that issues have a tag. For example, the lunch issue is tagged food, and delegation flows via tags. So this woman, Sherry, she delegated her food voting power to Lynn, and he voted on the lunch, and thus he had 2 votes for that vote because of the delegation. She did not delegate her IT tag to Lynn, so when Lynn voted on tablet purchasing, he only had his own vote. Another thing is that power flow is all or nothing, because you get this whole graph effect. Now, there was a paper written by, let's see, I think his name was Paolo Boldi in, I believe, 2009. And he described a whole system of flowing power through a liquid democracy network where it kind of had this exponential damp off and your power split and flowed as it went deeper into the graph. I wasn't real keen on that idea. I like the idea that people have to make decisions. We want to encourage people to be decisive. So what you do is you rank your delegates. You have to choose that, yes, I trust Lynn more than I trust this other guy for food voting, and then Lynn gets 100% of the vote if he votes. If he didn't vote, then the other guy would get 100% of the vote. So another thing that does is it makes the system more understandable. If I look and see what happened with my vote, it's very strange to explain to a lay user that 27.23% of your vote went this direction, 13.45% went in this direction, and you're like, what does that mean? If I say, you delegated to this person who delegated to that person and they voted on that, you're like, oh, that means something. That's an accountability chain. If I didn't like the vote, I know who to talk to. So I like this all or nothing approach. Another one is that issues can be restricted to groups. For example, the Hangouts t-shirt vote, we restricted to RTC all. And then we also found out that there were a few like Buzz SRE and a couple of people who weren't in RTC all who wanted to vote. And so we ended up adding like Buzz SRE and I think Conserver Eng for a couple other people who are Hangouts related, and they voted on the t-shirt. So obviously people who aren't in the group are not allowed to vote on group restricted issues, but there is this subtlety that you don't want power flowing across group boundaries. Like, for example, you can see that Sherry, the woman on the left, has delegated her vote to somebody outside the group. And if we didn't have that restriction, her delegated vote would have bounced back into the group again to somebody who could vote. And that would mean that that person had like 3 votes, which would include the person who's not in the group. So we cut anything that crosses a boundary. Another thing is that for simplicity in the UI, we only include a single tag per issue. The backend engine includes multiple tagging, and after we get to the point where we get some even more delegation usage, then we'll start seeing if it makes sense to expose that functionality. In the talk on the algorithms at the end, I will assume multiple tagging, the more general case. Another thing is this whole notion of privacy transparency. And there's something I call the golden rule of Google Votes, which I'll just read. That if I give you my vote, I can see what you do with it. It's this notion that delegation and visibility are complements. So you see this kind of little example here where A delegated their food vote to B, which means that B has to give visibility on their food votes to A. It kind of reverses the arrows. So in this case, the minimum visibility that's acceptable in this graph is for A to be able to see that B voted on the team lunch, but it is not necessarily the case that A can see whether B voted on tablet purchasing because A didn't delegate to B for IT. And I'll note that the golden rule only defines the minimum acceptable visibility. It doesn't actually give the visibility policy. For example, the everybody can see everything visibility policy is in fact compliant with the golden rule. So for Google Votes, we pretty much just implement link level visibility in the sense that if you can get the link to somebody's user page, you can see all their votes, which is why on every single Google Votes page, you'll see a little butter bar that says, hey, your votes may be visible to all google.com accounts. Take it with a grain of salt. But typically, we only share that link when people have a delegation relationship. And again, that's also kind of in the things we'll be doing more of as we need it, if we need to implement that tighter. Okay, so let's get into the specific UX experience of delegation. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole mechanics of voting. Please just watch the video from my last talk if you want to hear about that. I'm going to talk all about the UX that's specific to delegation. Now, first observation is that delegation is kind of hard to explain in the abstract. People are kind of like, okay, what good is that? But if you show them an example, people are like, oh yeah, obviously. Okay, because people are kind of familiar with representative democracy and proxies and people voting for them. So examples are good, instruction manuals are bad. Of course, that's just a general UI design principle, and always. Another thing is that the delegator and the delegate have different perspectives, but often somebody is both a delegator and a delegate at the same time. So you kind of have to make the UI friendly for work for both those roles, and you can't use separate screens. Another thing is we look at the difference between what delegator and delegates want is we say, we want this accountability, which is kind of this, if you delegate your vote to someone, you want to make sure they do the right thing with it, and you want to see what's going on. Otherwise, you get the bad things of representative democracy, where people they get your vote and they do whatever they want with it. But you also want to keep the process from being too obtrusive, because otherwise you start getting too close to direct democracy, where you have to do something for every vote, and then that doesn't scale. In general, the delegator, well, there's kind of this beauty of liquid democracy in that it benefits both the delegate and the delegator. The delegator benefits because they know, they don't have time and expertise to vote, and they get someone who they trust to do it for them. And generally, they want to find people who they can trust to delegate to. The delegate benefits from liquid democracy because they get more power and thus more influence over the world. So there are kind of two approaches we could take. We could say, do we want to start with the delegate experience or with the delegator experience? We decided to go with the delegate experience in terms of making it easy to get an entry into the system, because voting power has kind of a gamification aspect to it. It's kind of fun to acquire voting power. And we figured that would be an easier entry point than the delegate one. The delegate entry point would be doing things kind of like, here are suggested delegates, or hey, I see you voted in this way, and this way. Maybe you're interested in this person who votes in similar ways. And we're also planning to go in that direction, but we went with the delegate experience first. So here's how a delegate kind of gets introduced to delegation. So they just voted. And after they voted, they have the regular share button, which allows them to do share on Google Plus and do the conversations. And Google Votes has a nice discussion aggregation feature where as you're voting, you can scroll down and see all the Google Plus posts in one place. That's kind of the regular share. But it also has this advertise yourself button. And it kind of gives a little teaser that, hey, you can get more than one voting power. Who doesn't want more power? So you click that and you basically make a delegation ad, a little political ad on G+. And you can kind of fill it out and tell people why they should trust you with their food vote. Okay, so we send it, and then a potential delegate sees this ad, and they're like, okay, well, I'll bite. They click on it, and from that they can see the delegate's voting record, and they can from there click on some of the issues the delegate voted on, and see, hey, do I want to trust this person with my food vote or not? So, okay, so they delegate. And now we go back to the delegates view. So they're looking at an issue and they have some power here. One thing to note is that you're going to have different power on different issues, even if they have the same tags. Because if people voted directly, you don't get their delegated vote. And it also depends on the entire graph topology to see how much power you get. So at the bottom of every issue, there's a little voting power button. And if you click that, it'll tell you exactly what your voting power is and who delegated to you. In this case, VJ just gave us his delegated vote, so he's included in the list of delegates. We call this coverage, which I'll come back to when we get to algorithms. Another thing is this notion of accountability, in that what happens is we say, if you vote in someone's name, you have to tell them that you voted in their name. And we do that by sending them a Google Plus post. So right before we delegate to send that notification, we ask the delegate, we give them a choice, because there's actually a privacy issue for the delegate here, which is that maybe I don't want to tell people what I voted. Maybe I just want to vote, and because other people delegated to me, I don't necessarily want to share this specific vote. So there's always the option of casting a personal vote, which will only give you 1 point of voting power, but it won't send notifications to anybody else. Or you can accept voting power and then it'll send notifications. A subtle thing here comes with purely an implementation detail, but with the OAuth flow, we got a lot of flack early on with Google Votes because it required all kinds of scary OAuth permissions because we're making Google Plus posts on your behalf. To do that, with an App Engine app, you get a lot of scary looking dialogues. So people didn't like that. We got a few cute memes about that one. But so we restricted it to where we're only going to ask you for OAuth permissions at this point. So up till now, people can vote, be regular voters, do everything up until this point, until they click accept delegations on an issue, at which point we'll trigger them through the OAuth flow and ask for permission to post on Google+. So here's like an ad that or a notification I sent. So as a delegate, I see this show up in my stream. I see the little, Mr. Jingles notification thing, and I can see, oh, someone voted on my behalf. And if I choose to, the good thing is I don't have to just accept it. I can say, oh, I don't really like coconut juice, and I can click on it, and I can override their vote. So here's my view of a vote that's been a delegated vote. And you can see that the selections are all in yellow, and it says who you indirectly voted to. And you can just choose to select vote like usual and override it. Also at the bottom, you'll note there's a Google Votes link, which always brings you to your profile page. So as a delegate, I can see what's been done in my name. And you can see some of these things have votes that say like salad choices via Nia Malika, with a link where I can also see the person I delegated to. I can undelegate from this page by removing them. Another thing is that this page has to work for the delegate as well as the delegator. So this page will also show if people are delegating to you and show you all the votes that you've cast. Okay, so now let's talk about how do you actually implement all of this stuff, the algorithms behind it. There's three fundamental algorithms behind Google Votes: tally, coverage, and power. Now, tally is basically who won, and including all the indirect votes. So like in this case, you see mineral water won, but mineral water actually got some delegated or indirect votes. Coverage, that's kind of your profile page. It's what has been done in my name. So it includes all your direct votes and your indirect votes. Then power is it's a per issue thing, which is how much voting power would I have if I voted on this issue. It's kind of the oddball one. Tally and coverage we can compute together, and with power we have to do a few funny things, and we actually just get an estimate of power. But again, the two dialogues here we showed is that we need power for is so you can see that you're voting power on an issue if you click the link at the bottom, and also so that you can send the delegation notifications to the right people when you vote on their behalf. So here's kind of the object model. I've been implicitly using the same diagram notation, but I'm just formalizing it here. Users are circles, issues are rectangles. The set of tags for an issue is next to the issue, just right next to it. A delegation is an open arrow, and it's annotated with the tag. If there are more than one outgoing delegations from a node, it also includes this number n, which says whether it's that person's first, second, or third delegate choice. And then votes are solid arrows. For the example purposes, we're just going to look at yes/no voting. As mentioned in the previous talk, you can do, Google Votes also supports multiple choice voting with single selection, which is called simple plurality. It supports multiple choice voting with multiple selection, which is called approval voting. It supports ranked voting, where you can drag votes and kind of make an ordering, as well as range or score voting, where you kind of have a 5-star options for everything. And you can just try this out. You go to go/Google Votes, and it'll show you how to actually run things. But regardless of the type of voting, the flow is always the same. So we can just assume that it's a yes/no vote, and each of the yes/no votes is annotated with a plus or a minus indicating what type of vote it was. Just as an implementation note, we store the votes on the user object. And as people are voting, you don't get so much write contention because everybody's just writing to their own object, with one exception, and that's issues have a closing time, at which point they won't accept any more votes. And the first tally that's created after the closing time is the final tally, the thing that actually says, did this thing pass? Who was the winner? So after an issue closes, the tally stored on the issue becomes the authoritative object, not the vote stored on the user. In fact, if the user gets wiped out or deleted from the database, you don't want to start changing the past votes. The issue has to keep the same result. So also introduce the syntax of vote paths. So we have A, B, C plus 1 means A delegates to B, delegates to C, who votes yes on issue 1. I'll note that switching paths or switching tags on a path is allowed. A can delegate to B via one tag, B can delegate to C via a different tag, and yet still A has voted on issue 1. Now, kind of my logic there, you could make arguments on either side for this, but the way I think about it is that if you delegate to someone, you're trusting them. You're saying, I trust this person to do whatever it is they do to make this decision. Maybe they're flipping a coin. You don't know. You're trusting them with your vote. Maybe they're asking other people. Maybe they're doing research. Maybe they're experts on the subject matter. But we're saying, I said, yes, I trust you. Yes, I trust you with this issue. From then on, it's a black box. So based on that, I said, yeah, they can choose to delegate according to a different tag, as long as that issue has both the tags on it. Cycles are important. because what we do is we allow cycles in your delegate graph. I can delegate to someone, they can delegate to me, we can delegate however you want. And it's all resolved on a per issue basis. So for example, in issue 2 here, you can see that C voted on 2, B delegates to C who voted on 2, A delegates to B, delegates to C who voted on 2. But like and this is all kind of, you can kind of see the algorithms are all this kind of prefix thing where you grow the paths backwards. But as soon as we try to create a path C, A, B, C2, it goes, you basically, fails an assertion in the code even. You can't make a path that has the same node in it twice with a cycle. And it works out fine. Because you'll notice that, for example, issue 1 also gets all 3 of these people delegating to it, but they're different. It's a different ordering. Then, for example, if both B and C voted on the same thing, then depending on the delegation relationship, they might get different sets of delegates.
In that situation, you have B that has 2 votes, right?
If C were to vote on 1, if C were to vote on 1, then you would have, you'd get B getting a vote, and then A delegates to B gets a vote. So, which is kind of what you'd expect. So then, as I mentioned before, delegations are ordered, which resolves, this kind of multiple paths problem. Actually, I think I'll have some QA at the end, but please keep your questions. I am interested. Okay, so let's take an example, and I'll show how the tally and coverage algorithm work. We've got this whole graph here, and we want to say, did issue 1 or did issue 2 pass? And how did these people vote? Well, let's find out. So the first phase is we start with the issues, and we call the kind of level 0 is we take all the direct votes for. So for issue 1, we take all the direct paths to it, and the same for issue 2, and then we just do breadth first search going backwards. Important thing is that as we're growing these paths, we're not allowing cycles, and also we're checking that the paths all respect the tags. So for example, you can't do FDBA because F is delegating to D via gamma, and or FDBA1, and when 1 is not labeled gamma. So you go back, you backtrack, and you get all the possible paths for all issues. The next stage is you make a bunch of user issue pairs. You gather up, it's kind of like making a matrix, so that for each pair you have all the paths that go between that user and that issue. This is kind of like a reduce step in a map reduce. Then after that, for each set of pairs, you grab the best pair. This is where we're getting rid of duplicate votes. I may have 2 paths to the vote through 2 different ways, but I only get 1 vote. Now, some comparisons are easy, like in row C, you see C voted directly on issue 1, and C also delegated to A, who voted on issue 1. Direct vote always beats an indirect vote, so that's a clear winner there. In this particular table, there's only one comparison that's not trivial, and that's FEC1 versus FA1, in which case you actually have to look at the delegation graph and see that F ranked E above A in their delegation ordering. So we could have used this very long, obnoxious syntax that would have all these number signs in it, but that just gets too wordy. Okay, then after we have all the best pairs, we accumulate by rows and columns. So for issue 1, we add up all the yes, no votes and no votes, and it passes with yes. Same for issue 2. Coverage, we add everything in the other direction, and we get, for, say, user C, they can see that they voted on both issue 1 and issue 2, as well as knowing exactly how they voted through these delegated people. Okay, that gives you tally and coverage at the same time. Now power. Power is a weird one, because power is saying how much power would I have if I voted? I haven't actually voted on this thing, so the information's all, so now we're all at request time. Like tally and coverage, we did all in the background with background jobs, and we can do long graph algorithms there. So I'm A. So as soon as A is looking at issue 10, we we don't actually have an edge in the graph between A and issue 10. That's the tricky part. So what we do is we pre-compute something called potential for all users, and then we use that to make an estimate that is fast enough for request time. Now, what a potential object looks like is that for every user, we say, what is their potential for incoming votes from that tag? So for example, user A's beta potential, you can see that C delegates to A, F delegates to A, so that gives them some potential. And we also do this kind of breadth first search backtracking to compute potential objects to give, for example, that F could delegate to E, could delegate to C, could give A a vote on anything labeled B. Then at request time, we apply the potential. So let's say A is thinking about voting on issue 10. Another thing that's tricky is that in the background, for each user, we don't know exactly who's voted on what issue, because again, in the background, we don't know that there's a connection between this user and this issue. So at request time, we dig up the potential for all of issue 10's tags. Note that we ignore the gamma potential because issue 10 is only tagged alpha and beta. So we dig up the potential, and then we look up all the users in the potential, and we see if they still exist, and if they voted, make sure they're a group that you're allowed to be in, and we filter them. Note that you can't have a path that has invalid user anywhere in the path, like FECA, because C voted, which means that C already grabbed that vote. So F and E already gave their votes to C, so they're gone. You can't use FECA or ECA. All that's left is BA and FA, and we say your potential estimate is 3 from those two users and yourself. So this estimate has some problems. I mean, it's kind of good enough in practice for people to get an idea of, do I have a lot of power on this issue and it's worth me putting a lot of effort because 100 people are delegating to me, or do I not have any power on this issue? It's pretty good. But there's some edge cases it doesn't cover. Like it doesn't cover the switching tags thing because we're doing potential per tag. So if it switches tags, you're out of luck. So DBA actually is a valid vote, but since DBA is a tag switch from beta to alpha, it isn't included in the estimate. And also, this whole kind of global best paths thing doesn't get covered. So F actually gave their vote to C because they went through FECA along the right side of the graph. But A thinks that F is in its potential. So, but the algorithms that really matter the most, tally and coverage, they do get it right. They're exact algorithms. So the vote gets counted correctly, and at the end we want to say, what did I vote on? What happened? That is also accurate. Okay, and I'll conclude with just a thanks to the extended Google Votes team. My co-lead in this is Greg Wolf in San Francisco, and the third main programmer is Leo Lopez in Brazil, who especially did a lot of the UI work right before the Microkitchen Fair. And then our workplace services point of contact, Courtney Nelson, who's been working with us for the last 2 years, who's just talked to a lot of customers and worked with groups to actually set up votes, coordinate the timing of things, and follow up on a lot of things. She's been invaluable, as well as other members of RUSE who've coordinated events and other 20% contributors who've contributed either code or UX design. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions now. Okay, actually, I'll pass the mic around for this so we can get it on the recording.
So, yeah, it's on. So you've got really great examples of how this has worked on kind of one-off votes, but we see from game theory that strategies and outcomes change pretty significantly once you iterate a scenario. Do you have any thoughts on how you would dog food this in kind of an iterated multi-vote with the same delegates in the same group sort of thing?
Yeah, that's been our kind of big goal, is to get iterative voting, and we're aiming for that with the food thing for the So as with the Microkitchen stuff, in terms of being able to vote on the product, and then as they have little tweaks for each Microkitchen to say, oh, hey, here's a new product. Do you guys want to vote on this? And then you get the same group of people delegating and continuously voting. That's our primary entry point to get into that space.
Cool. Thanks.
Couple quick questions. Is there a way where you could see all of your consolidated votes that you've cast, either personally or delegated?
Yes, just go to go/gvotes. That's this the profile page. And at the bottom of any voting page is a link that just says Google Votes. You click there, and that gives you your whole thing. But that's also the whole coverage thing. The coverage algorithm generates that view.
Okay, another quick question. Is there a way, you as a delegate, to be able to see abandonment? People either overrode your vote or abandon you?
Not explicitly right now. I mean, you can. The only thing you'd really be able to see is that if you look at the issue's voting power at one point, and if later on it goes down, then you'll know that people have either voted directly or delegated away from you. You can also look at your user page and see how many delegates you have, and obviously if that's going down, people are abandoning you. But we don't have metrics on it, or like graphs or something.
So when someone creates an issue, they could conceivably deliberately add tags that are not appropriate or deliberately omit tags that would be appropriate. Do you have an idea of to what extent the system can be gamed that way?
Yes, I thought about this, the whole kind of taxonomy problem. In some ways, our current solution or our current approach is you tag it once at issue creation time, and then when people look at the issue, they can see if it's not tagged quite right. We don't have direct protection against that. One concept which I would like to build is something I call the no vote, which is not implemented right now, which is the idea for somebody to say, it's not I'm voting no on a yes/no vote. It's I don't think this thing is worth voting on. That I vote on this thing and it basically buries my vote. Because what happens is, let's say I have a lot of delegated power behind me. Somebody else also has some delegated power, but I'm more trusted. And I look at this issue and I say, this issue is garbage. You know, they're using misleading terminology. Maybe they're playing games with the tags. They've purposely excluded the options to take options that all just happen to be favorable to them. You know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this vote should be buried, or this issue should be buried. Because if I don't do that, and then what happens is everybody who delegates to me, all of their votes go nowhere. As opposed to what would happen is if I just ignore it, like I do in a regular democracy system, all those votes that I would, people have trusted me, they go to someone else who's maybe less reputable or less thinking about other problems of the issue. It's kind of one thing I want to implement there. Another thing is, in like a public product, there's this whole notion of how do you introduce an issue and find that it's trustworthy. And I'm leaning towards an idea of kind of like a quorum, or like let's say you have a group and you're doing a fully distributed thing. Typical rule might be anybody can create an issue, but the issue needs at least 60% of the group to have voted directly or indirectly in order for it to pass. So then, because otherwise people can just introduce issues, have two people vote on it, and it passes. What does that mean, right? So in this case, also a no vote would kind of keep the issue from getting its quorum, and it would just be lost. Those are my thoughts in that direction.
You mentioned that once there's a tally, it's authoritative, and users can even be deleted after that point. Is there an audit trail once there's a tally, even if users go away?
Yeah, we have the full voting record, including the indirect votes when the vote was cast. We don't keep changed votes. So if you delete your vote or if you change your vote before the thing closes, that's gone. But the final, the full paths are kept with the.
So there's a record of the deleted users as well.
Right. Okay. Any other questions?
Just a technical question. How do you handle conflicting tags? Like if an issue is tagged with alpha and beta, and I've delegated alpha to this person and beta to that person, how are those prioritized? Is that a...
So one thing, so I talked about the prioritization of tags, and I kind of had those little number signs. Those prioritizations are for the entire, actually, let me just go back and grab one of the nodes here. Like something kind of like this, but imagine that instead of both of them being, one of them's food, the other one is budget, and the lunch is so expensive that you actually is tagged both food and budget because you got to vote on how much money you're going to spend for lunch. In this case, the way I resolve that is I use a per user a global ordering. So you actually, this number one, number two thing is actually saying for all the, it's actually per user, not per delegation tag. So yeah, and it also kind of makes the UI a little simpler in the sense that rather than looking at all my delegations, I look at a list of users and I say, which of these people do you trust more? And you've got to say, I always trust this person more than I trust this person. And later on, if we really, really wanted to get fancy, you could make the numbers per tag, but I wouldn't envision launching something like that anytime soon. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Thanks for attending.